On a fog-soaked morning in 2009, deputies in a small coastal town received a frantic call. A man had disappeared while swimming near a rocky inlet known for its violent, unpredictable currents. His abandoned clothes were found neatly folded on the shoreline. His wallet and identification were inside. No body was recovered. Authorities classified it as a likely drowning. But the victim, a convicted sex offender facing new charges, left behind a trail of questions that didn't sit right with investigators. He was scheduled to appear in court the following week, and prosecutors were preparing a case that could send him to prison for decades. Yet here he was, reportedly swept out to sea, vanishing without a trace. His family insisted it was a tragic accident. Friends attended a memorial service. Newspapers published obituaries describing him as a troubled man, taken too soon. Case closed, or so it seemed. Behind the scenes, detectives reviewed surveillance footage, phone records, and financial details. Something felt off. His bank account had been drained the day before his death. A vehicle matching his car had been spotted near a bus station hours after his clothes were found. And most importantly, there was no evidence that he'd actually entered the water. Still, without a body and with no clear leads, the investigation stalled. The man was officially declared dead. But for 14 years, a faint suspicion lingered. Detectives had no idea that the truth would surface more than a decade later, thanks to one overlooked detail, one digital fingerprint, that would unravel the lie he spent years crafting. And when that clue emerged, everything they thought they knew about the case would flip upside down. For 14 years, the case remained buried in dusty archives, just another cold file marked presumed deceased. But in 2023, a newly formed fugitive task force was digitizing old records when the man's file resurfaced. One detective, a meticulous analyst named Rachel Torres, noticed something odd. A flag database hit from 2 years earlier that no one had followed up on. It was a small thing, a routine background check tied to a job application in another state. The name on the form was different, but the social security number was only 1 digit off from the sex offender's original number. Usually, such a near match would be dismissed as a typo. But the birth date, the height, the scars listed, they aligned too perfectly. Torres dug deeper. She pulled employment records, tax filings, and digital footprints from multiple states. Whoever this new identity belonged to, he moved often, never staying more than 18 months in one town. He worked under-the-table jobs, avoided banks, and rented rooms using prepaid cards. He had no social media, no digital photos, and no online presence beyond what was legally required. A ghost, a man hiding in plain sight. Then came the breakthrough. A routine facial recognition sweep, part of a cross-agency pilot program, matched a driver's license photo from a rural county to an old registry photo of the presumed dead offender. The resemblance was undeniable. The age progression, bone structure, jawline, it was him. Torres' heart pounded as she pulled the file. The man had renewed a driver's license under yet another alias, this time using a low-resolution photo booth image. It was sloppy, rushed, and likely done in panic. She immediately alerted the task force commander. Within hours, an interstate investigation was launched. After 14 years of silence, their fugitive had made his first mistake. And now the hunt was on. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Once detectives confirmed the man was alive, the scope of his deception became staggering. 14 years earlier, he had faked his own death with meticulous planning. Clothes neatly folded on a shore, wallet and identification left behind, and no witnesses to contradict his supposed drowning. Everything pointed to a perfectly executed escape. For years, authorities, family, and the public believed the story. But the reality was far darker. The man had abandoned his old life, severed ties with friends and family, and built a new identity from scratch. He moved across states, avoided banks, and used cash almost exclusively. He had no digital footprint and no social media presence, carefully leaving no trace for investigators to follow. Every move was calculated, every interaction carefully monitored. Yet, even the most meticulous criminals make mistakes. One minor detail, a traffic camera capturing a car matching his previous vehicle model near a small town in Arizona triggered a slow unraveling. Investigators combined this with a pattern from tax records and job applications, mapping a trail spanning multiple counties. Each step uncovered more lies, aliases, falsified documents, and stories crafted to avoid suspicion. Witnesses who had briefly interacted with him recalled odd behavior, sudden disappearances, and inconsistent personal histories. The authorities began constructing a timeline, connecting the dots from the moment he vanished in 2009 to his most recent sightings. The man was no longer just a missing person. He was a fugitive on the run, a master of evasion whose trail was finally becoming visible. The question now was clear. How do you capture a man who had lived off the grid for over a decade? How could law enforcement bring closure to the victims he had eluded and the communities he had unsettled? The answer lay in the one overlooked clue, buried in plain sight for 14 years, that would ultimately expose his deception. After more than a decade of dead ends, detectives finally zeroed in on a clue so small it had been overlooked for years. A prepaid credit card the fugitive had used briefly at a convenience store in a remote town. Alone, it seemed insignificant, but when cross-referenced with dozens of other transactions, patterns began to emerge. Timing, location, and frequency formed a faint trail that pointed directly to a specific county in New Mexico. Detective Rachel Torres realized this was the break they'd been waiting for. The man had grown overconfident, relying on outdated tactics to hide his movements. For 14 years, he had thought he was invisible, but even ghosts leave traces. The team quickly combined this new information with traffic camera footage, alias records, and rental agreements. Each piece reinforced the other, slowly revealing the man's current location. Forensic accountants traced small cash deposits at a local bank, each carefully structured to avoid suspicion, but enough to leave a paper trail. Authorities mounted surveillance and waited. Days turned into nights as law enforcement watched his routines, studying the patterns, noting his comings and goings. It was a delicate operation. Any sudden move could tip him off. Then came the moment of truth. A neighbor reported seeing someone matching the fugitive's description entering a modest RV parked at the edge of town. The vehicle was registered under an alias, but the team had already tied it to him through careful investigation. It was the culmination of 14 years of mystery, deception, and evasion. The clue that finally cracked the case had been sitting in plain sight, hidden in mundane transactions and overlooked records. All that remained was the arrest, carefully planned, precise, and inevitable. The fugitive who had fooled the system for over a decade was finally within reach. The fugitive's days on the run were finally over. After 14 years of living in the shadows, the man who had faked his own death was cornered. Law enforcement assembled a tactical team, carefully coordinating the arrest to ensure no chance of escape. They knew from prior surveillance that he was cautious, hyper-aware, and potentially dangerous. One misstep could allow him to vanish again. The RV, parked on the outskirts of a quiet town, became the focal point of months of painstaking investigation. Detectives approached undercover, taking advantage of the knowledge gained from 14 years of his mistakes. The small patterns, the aliases, and the predictable routes he used. Inside the RV, the fugitive was found alone, living a minimal, transient lifestyle, but still maintaining the documents, disguises, and careful routines he had perfected over more than a decade. When the team moved in, there was no chase, no dramatic confrontation. He had underestimated the diligence of investigators. Fingerprints, facial recognition, and digital records confirmed his identity beyond a shadow of a doubt. The man who had eluded capture for so long was finally in custody. The arrest brought immediate closure to law enforcement and relief to the communities he had unsettled. For over a decade, he had been a ghost, a cautionary tale of how one man can disappear from the system. But justice had caught up, and the case that spanned 14 years would finally have answers. In interviews, detectives stressed that the smallest oversight, the one clue that seemed insignificant at first, had been the turning point. A single breadcrumb had unraveled years of deception, proving that no matter how carefully a fugitive hides, the truth has a way of catching up. The story of a man who faked his death evaded authorities, and lived a double life for 14 years would now serve as a chilling reminder. Justice, no matter how delayed, is relentless.